We are going to be talking about people experience and how you can use Agile mindset to start to build this in your organization. And we've got a fantastic collaborator of many years, Nabel, online with us today. And I'm going to get Nabel to introduce herself very soon. So we're going to look at what does it mean what is kind of people experience to start with, and then how do we start to build great people experience through the organizations that we work, and what does this start to mean for HR, our operating model, our teams, and also kind of the way we work with the business. And that's what we're going to explore in this meetup. We'd love to know your insights, your questions throughout. So please use chat. We have an assistant, great looking assistant called Tim, who's covering chat, and he'll hand over the questions to Nabel and I, and we'll make sure that we answer them as we go through. And this is the great opportunity to get Nabel to introduce herself, and then I'll say a few words myself. So over to you, Nabel.
Thanks, Natal. Thanks for inviting me, and hi to everybody that's joined today. It's lovely to see people from so many different parts of the world joining, which is brilliant. So Natal asked me to join and share some experiences, and I guess that is born of the shared experiences we've had over time working together, and our shared passion for Agile in HR. And I'm really excited to be able to just share some of the things that have worked well and that have landed brilliantly in businesses, but perhaps also things that maybe are more challenging as you go through perhaps thinking about a different way of working. And I hope to be able to perhaps draw on some experiences from the various organisations I've worked for in the last few years. And it would be really lovely to have questions from you guys in case there's anything we don't cover in what we're talking about, because if you're curious about something, I'm a real fan of just being able to share and collaborate with people. So anything that you think of that you think would be useful to delve into more, feel free to ask the question. It'd be really nice to be able to interact with you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nabel. And as Nabel mentioned, we have collaborated for a long time, and we first met each other when she was working at River Island, and she's now at Roche, so she'll talk a bit about those different experiences. And my name is Natal Dank, for people that aren't familiar with me, and I head up the learning, coaching and community at PXO Culture. I've also just written the Agile HR book, which is the next shout out. And if you want to get one with 20% off, you can go over to PXO Culture. So still in the kind of surreal moment of being able to be called an author, which is quite strange, but very lovely. But this kind of represents all the experiences over the years of working with people like Nabel around how do you really start to do Agile HR in your organization. It's very contextual. So we want to also in this discussion be really upfront that, what this looks like in your organization could be quite different to the next person. And so it's about being really practical and finding out about how you can start things, how you can make changes within the places that you work for the better. A bit of a shout out before we get going for the next virtual meetup, and that's going to be on the 24th of November. And again, inviting someone I worked with years ago who is a strategy expert, and she's worked in a range of strategy roles. And we're going to look at what does it mean to build business strategy and people strategy, truly get buy-in and actually start to drive that across an organization in the pandemic world. So that means revisiting, pivoting, clarifying, and really getting that alignment around vision and purpose for allowing teams to make the decisions of how to get it done themselves. So we're going to explore that in our next meetup. Also at PXO Culture, there's fantastic digital learning that you can get hold of, and this can be in-house for your teams or also in the public environment. We look at agile ways of working and, of course, human-centered design, which we're going to look at a lot today. And then depending on where you are in your journey, you may be interested in some of the masterclasses around strategy, around your operating model, or helping lead transformation in a HR role. Okay, so let's get into it. And what we wanted to do was kind of get a bit of an idea of what's your thoughts about this term that we're using, which is people experience. So let's have a poll to begin with. The questions are now up on your screen, just in case the poll doesn't work for you, which I do find for some people, depending on how they've logged in. But what I'll do is I'm going to launch the poll now and love to hear your comments and your thoughts. So poll is up. So the first question is, how much do you use the term people experience in your work? So is this something that you do use or you have no idea what we're talking about? And then second question is, how would you define people experience? And you can choose more than, maybe I did I set that up that way? I thought I did, that you can choose more than one, but maybe I didn't. So which one do you like the most out of all of those? User experience of work, a new multifunctional HR operating model, working cross-functionally with teams like facilities and IT to deliver end-to-end accountability for people, processes and systems, approaching the employee lifecycle like a customer journey, and then another term from engagement. So let's see what you think around that. So we do have a kind of a fairly strong answer around all the time using people experience, but definitely also people online that saying a little bit or not at all. So that's really interesting. So we'll kind of explore what this means for people on the call. And then next of all, how would you define people experience? So we've got some seeing it as the user experience of work. And so there is this idea that it comes from this concept of design thinking and the UX that is in a lot of our products and services. No one's gone for the new multifunctional HR operating model. So that's interesting. We'll talk a bit about that. We do have some saying, yeah, well, it is about working with other parts of the business to do more of this end-to-end accountability around our processes and systems. So I think this is a really interesting aspect to what we're going to talk about today. And then we've got a big shout out for it is the employee lifecycle like a customer journey. So this is really interesting. And this kind of also feeds into the idea of user experience and this end-to-end accountability. So they are kind of starting to all feed into each other. And then also another term for engagement. And we do have developments of all these terms in HR, don't we? So we can kind of debate that as well. And then Siobhan's add-on to that is also using people experience all the time and approaching the employee experience life cycle like a customer journey. So we've had a kind of strong connection with that. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to close that out. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of feed off that and just talk a little bit about the topic overall. And then I'm going to go into a series of questions for Nabel. And from that point onwards, please add any questions or insights that you'd like to bring to the conversation. As you heard earlier, Nabel is very keen for your questions. So please let us know. And on that note, I'm going to actually ask Nabel to start this conversation. So what's your thoughts, Nabel? What is people experience? Why do you like to use this term?
So I guess to start with, it's really great to see the results of that poll because I also selected the answer around it being in reference to the life cycle, a bit like a customer journey. So I guess for me, it's very much about putting into place things that enable people to have a work environment that they can thrive in. So that can take so many different forms and so many different points in time with an employee and people across organisations. But if you stick with a mindset of thinking, is what we're delivering, is what we're giving out to the business, is what we're partnering with the business on, truly creating an environment that enables people to be the best they can be and truly thrive in the work that they do and be happy in the work that they do, I feel like that is kind of the bedrock of what people experience is about. And then you connect that into the principle around employee life cycle, customer journey, that kind of thing. And if you utilize that as your premise, you can start to see where those touch points are or those moments that matter are in the employee journey. And my view is actually it almost starts before someone's joined an organisation. So when you think about that employee life cycle piece, you're going right from that point in time where someone's even interested in wanting to join your business. So the piece around how you position yourself with your employee brand and your employee value proposition, and people being interested enough to want to come and join the business. And then when they do take a step to join the business, what's their experience through perhaps a recruitment or a selection process? How do they feel through that? Do they continue to want to be part of this organisation? And you start to build a relationship with that person in a way that sets the tone for if and when they join the business. Continuing through to meet their expectations around what onboarding might look like when they join the organisation, and in fact almost exceeding expectations by delivering things above and beyond what someone would expect as the norm when they join. And continuing to create those moments that matter through someone's career. And their career within an organisation might be a year, it might be 10 years. I think the thing to consider with that is the world of work is moving so much faster now. And so when you start to then think about when someone might be coming towards the end of a career within an organisation, especially if it's a shorter time they've been with a business, what also do we do to make sure that people experience stays fantastic right to the very last point? So much so that the door stays open and you can stay connected with those people, because there's a high probability that you have a great relationship with someone all the way through to the finish of their employment within a business. They may even come back. And even if they don't come back to you, they continue to be an advocate of that organisation and encourage people to go and work with that business. And I think there are points in that life cycle that HR can do quite well. But I think there's points in it where we probably lose sight of the importance of the experience that people receive. And I think certainly to the end of the kind of employee life cycle where perhaps somebody's chosen to leave a business, I think it's very easy to say, oh, they want to leave, so we won't really focus on them very much. But actually, really looking across all areas and not forgetting some of those key points when it means so much to somebody how they're being treated and how they're being looked after. So for me, in summary, I suppose people experiences, environments that enable people to thrive, and identify those moments that matter through the entire life cycle of an employee within an organisation.
What's really interesting about that, first of all, is a couple of points. One is I love the word relationship. So we build a relationship with the people that work in the organisation. And I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at it, of how is it more around knowing what they're thinking, doing and feeling, and how we help them be great in their job. And that's a slightly different to setting up processes to help people work. So that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Also, this idea of helping people thrive, I really like how that connects through to the agile premise of delivering value. So how in HR do we deliver value to the business? Well, first and foremost, we help people go and deliver value through the business and to that end customer, and understanding that sort of kind of impact that we have is central to building a great in-people experience. What I would kind of add onto that, and this is where I think so fascinating for HR now, of how we start to build our teams around this concept, and what does that start to mean for our operating model, and what does that mean for how we sort of represent ourselves in the business and collaborate with the business. So I see this very much as modern HR, and I would add the word operations to it, because this is our infrastructure, this is our sort of lean tech services that underpin things, not necessarily just one big HRIS, but what we have in our organizations. And it's about maintaining a portfolio of products and services that is constantly either being updated, maintained, but sometimes being removed to keep that whole, as you said, that whole life cycle going. And what we start to really focus on to enable people to thrive, we need to know what their pain points are along that journey. As you said, perhaps the exit, perhaps when they start a new role. We know some of them already, isn't it? A new manager always struggles. So how do we actually make sure that that pain point can be solved? And how do we go after solving problems for our people so their experiences is constantly being improved and they're connecting with our vision and purpose. Because part of this, I think, is the key, isn't it? It's about building loyal people, just like in that customer environment. And that could be that you could be a non-for-profit organization that needs to build this just as much as a profit. So the same premises exist. Excellent. So part of that is also thinking about how this connects to the agile mindset. And if agility is first and foremost around this idea of a feedback loop. How do we iterate? How do we incrementally deliver value? So if you're thinking about that employee life cycle and journey, and you see a pain point, well, what we're saying in Agile is you go in and first of all, understand more that what's going on there. What is the experience for the user? But also let's go and test, experiment, and prototype what could fix that problem before we roll out the whole solution, and particularly before we roll it out across the organization, because it might mean that we need to personalize this a bit, or at least segment it for different parts of the organization. And so this is about getting closer to the customer, and I'm definitely going to explore this more with Nabel. And so when you bring Agile into HR, it's a really fantastic concept, because having your customer at the heart is having our people at the heart of what we do. And we're constantly looking at how do we deliver value? How do we quantify that value? How do we measure that value that we're delivering through? So it really helps us prioritize and be seen as a value add team, which I think is so central to what we're trying to achieve in HR. And then ultimately that brings us to co-creating the employee experience. And I love that Nabel has already touched on this whole concept of the journey that the employee goes through. And this is what we're doing in business. And this is what teams like marketing and product design have been doing for a number of years very successfully. I had a meetup a few weeks ago and someone said, it's okay to call your employee a customer, because if you make the experience fantastic for your employee, like the customer, that's the best, isn't it? So, and we're saying we should have quality relationships with our customers and that are authentic and real, then that's the same with our employees. So there's a lot of benefits. And this idea of co-creating the employee experience is why I embraced Agile HR to begin with and never look back, because it means you're taking people through change rather than implementing change onto them. And it's a revolutionary concept once you start working that way. And I personally have never looked back. Okay, so let's get into some of our questions. Love to hear your insights so far, and also any questions you'd like to add to the discussion. Please just pop them into chat. Let's get into our first question. So Nabel, we've talked a little bit about your kind of your sort of story so far. So you've had previous roles, previous organizations. So if you think about that career up until this point, what's your thoughts? Why is everyone talking about agile mindset and focusing on this idea of the people experience at this moment in time? What's going on?
I think to start with, we have to acknowledge that historically HR has been very traditional and too slow, and often quite stuck in our ways. And often the case, think that we know best over what the business wants and needs. So, I mean, that's the starting point. And facing into that and recognising that, you know what, that's not going to serve us particularly well, and that's not going to serve our customers and our businesses particularly well. And realising that putting in place and being the gatekeepers of stringent policy and difficult processes that don't make people's lives easier are the things that we should really be challenging and questioning how and why we're doing what we're doing. But for me, that's kind of the starting point, and being comfortable enough to say, actually, this is enough of a reason to say we need to do things quite differently. We should not be seen in organisations as just being the gatekeepers of policy and process. We should actually be seen in an organisation as true enablers, and like Natal said, value add, and working on supporting the business to perform as best as it possibly can, rather than making things more difficult. And so often I've had conversations with people that they recognise that perhaps a process or a way of doing something is probably not that great, but it's this kind of, yeah, but that's just how we have to do it because they're the rules, and we kind of have to do that in HR. And I say, why? Why should we just do it the way we've always done it, just because? You know, why shouldn't we pull it apart, scrutinize what we're doing, really listen to what the business wants and needs, and then rebuild something, but co-create it in partnership with the business, and not do what we often do, which is kind of maybe get a brief on something and get told by the business, oh, we think we need this. And then HR retreats into their corner of the business and says, okay, we're going to work on this solution. And it might take us 3 or 4 months. And when we're ready, we'll present it back, all finished, all singing, all dancing and perfect. And when that happens, the business goes, actually, it's not really what we wanted. And you haven't entirely listened to us. And then we feel like, oh, we put our heart and soul into something for the last 3 or 4 months, and now we haven't landed what we needed to for the business. And if you flip that and you think about the agile way of working, agile is much more, okay, we've heard the brief, we've heard what the business wants. What we're going to do is we're going to test and experiment on a few things. We're going to prototype some stuff, and in short bursts, we're going to loop back and gather feedback on the journey of co-creating something, so that we can make sure we're on the right track, so that we're not so wedded to a plan that we can't adapt as we go, meeting the needs of the business based on the feedback that we're getting.
Thanks, Nabeel. We slightly lost you a little bit just towards the end, but I know that you were talking about this idea of kind of letting go of the perfect, because what is perfect when it comes to HR? And perfect is that people engage and use what we create. And you don't know that until you see them using it and engaging with it. And you have to actually test that early and often to know that you're actually going to deliver something that is anywhere near perfect. And this is quite a different thing. It's different to it being shiny and looking great to begin with. It's not that it's crap, but it's actually working and working well. And I think what's interesting about the pandemic, I've heard a lot of teams focusing this minimal viable product concept has just had to happen. So, okay, I first of all had to just put to the side the huge cultural values transformation project that I was working on, because suddenly we're going into lockdown and I need to get a helpline up and running within a number of days. Okay, how could we make that work? Let's, quickly get something going. Let's test it and then let's evolve it. And so it's been really interesting to see teams just naturally embrace this way of working because they've had to. So there's been nothing like a pandemic to sort of focus people's minds on what agility is all about. What I really liked is you said, how do we know what's best? And this idea of helping people in their job. And this is about decreasing complexity. And there's been a really interesting study by MIT to say that what really is employee experience is reducing the complexity and then tapping into what people think, feel, and do. And complexity is what we're facing in the world, isn't it? And that's what agility is all about, an answer to kind of find solutions to complex problems. So I think if you see our role as helping people get the work done in the easiest, simplest way, and so our processes need to add to that as opposed to be a blocker, then it's a very different way of looking towards what we do. So next question. So you've been doing this people experience for a while, or attempting to make it happen. So can you tell us a bit more about what you've done in your last few HR roles to deliver people experience across an organisation?
Yeah, so I was reflecting on this actually, and I was thinking back across various roles that I've had in different organisations, and actually, firstly, I went back into some of that we delivered when I was working within Virgin. So the culture within Virgin actually lends itself really well to focusing on people experience, because it is a people first culture that recognises that if your employees are engaged and happy, they will do a great job for your customers, and if your customers are then happy, the business is successful. And actually, when I reflected on it, the work that we were doing back then, when we were referred to as people and performance as a team rather than HR in itself, was there were very few HR teams that were really recognising that you were more than just core HR, and we had a real emphasis on well-being of employees. And I know that's something that now is really predominant in our focus in HR, but actually back then I'm not sure many businesses were really realising the value in looking at employee well-being at all levels. And I think what we did really well back then was realise that it wasn't just about offering the odd thing and then a class or a massage or what have you. We also were really rigorously looking at the impact and understanding how much people engaged in the things that we were providing to them across the business, translating that into data to see whether we're supporting overall retention in the business and engagement in the business, and in turn productivity. So for me, that although back then I don't think we really realised we were doing necessarily about working in an agile way, it was certainly something earlier on in my, there was definitely a real emphasis on people experience rather than HRs being the owners of policy and process. And then when you kind of move forward, and as Natal mentioned, I then moved on and worked within River Island, very different kind of business model, going from airline and travel industry into retail, but still the culture of focusing on how people feel and making environments that people feel they can thrive in was still paramount. And this is where really the people experience piece absolutely came to life. I was very fortunate in my role there. When I joined business, the role I took on was new and newly established within the organisation, so it gave me a great opportunity to build something from scratch. And initially that was a focus very much on talent within the organisation, but gradually that evolved into establishing a dedicated people experience department. And that department was absolutely responsible for what we've talked about before, which is this whole employee life cycle. So across that department, we looked at is our employee brand and how do we attract people and how do we engage people with before they've joined the business? What do we then do to create the most engaging onboarding experience? How do our people feel like they've got every opportunity to develop and grow in their role and within their career? We focus very much on recognition and driving engagement through recognition through the business. And we also incorporated employee communications as well. So there were so many different facets to building and creating this kind of ecosystem around delivering on people experience across the organisation. And I think what's really important when you're doing that is you tap into senior leaders within the business and help them to see the value in investing in this kind of activity and this kind of focus, and making sure it's very closely aligned to the overall organisational strategy and what the business is trying to achieve. So I guess they're kind of the two standout things for me when I was sort of reflecting on some of the things from past organisations. And then more recently joining Roche, which again, very industry and very different culture within the organisation. And what we're working on right now is quite extraordinary in terms of scale. So it's recognising that across the size of organisation that we are, which is around 130,000 people globally, we need to radically change our operating model around how we support the business and move away from traditional HR to bringing in a networked approach to supporting our organisation globally. So we're working through something pretty pioneering right now, which sometimes feels amazing and sometimes feels really hard. But that's all part of the process. That's all part of building through iterations, testing and learning as we go, but staying focused on what it is, our mission is, and where we're trying to move towards and what we're trying to achieve.
Really interesting. And first of all, thank you for going off the video, because I think that's really helped with your connection and we could hear you a lot better there. Thank you, Nabel. Great to hear, I think, just how contextual this is. So based on your culture, based on the size of your team, based on the size of your actual organisation, what this look and feels like can be quite different. So I think that's what I took away from that first and foremost. And a few things there. So first of all, the focus on well-being to begin with in your Virgin role. Josh Burson at the moment is talking about this top to down, top to bottom, so full organizational focus on well-being. And so well-being is also this sort of next level of how are our people experiencing work and what's going on for them, and how do we touch into that. what I then love, and I saw Donna also comment on it, what you were doing at River Island, which is this full view of the employee cycle, and how do you actually then deliver against that? And for me, this is really very much modern HR. Where are we going, and how do we start to structure our teams around delivering this full end-to-end accountability, which is also collaborating very much with other parts of the business to do that. If we take onboarding, for example, it's not just HR, it's IT support, it's facilities, it's legal, it's finance, it's all of these areas. So how are we doing a much more kind of collaborative approach to how we deliver these solutions in the business? I'll definitely come back to your comments around now working in this huge kind of entity that is Roche and shifting HR from that traditional way of working, because that's really interesting experience. I'd love to go into our next question. We've got some great questions coming in. So I'd go into the next one because this sort of relates to what you've just been talking about, and then we'll pop into a few of the participants' questions and go from there, if you're comfortable with that, Nabel. So the next question is, so what does this mean for HR? So we've talked already a bit about this full view of the employee life cycle. And this means I think the end of sort of silos within HR, because this is not, talent over here, recruitment over here, and reward somewhere else. This is working together. But then also we've just touched on this idea of working with other parts of the business as well. So what's your thoughts at the moment of what this can look like in terms of an operating model?
Yeah, I think I'll share a bit more about what we're doing at Roche, but I think the first thing to consider here is and I'd like to, I'm sure, we've got some curious people that have joined today that no doubt have probably already explored doing things in different ways, which is great. But if you're in a position, or you think you're still working in a way where the kind of traditional HR disciplines are working in isolation and working in silo, that's the first thing to just pull apart. To me, in every instance, whether it's HR or otherwise, in every organisation department, working in silos is never going to be successful. So breaking down those barriers and recognising that, you might have an expertise in being a core recruiter, but no reason why you need to just stay in that lane. Why would you not move across and do different things, be involved in various areas of HR or across people experience, in order to bridge that gap between those different points in time that we look at as the employee life cycle. So I think that's the first piece that needs to be looked at in terms of mindset and how people work within HR. I think oftentimes people that have perhaps been in their career for many years, and it can sometimes feel difficult to transition from different areas to one another. But I think that's something that needs to be worked through within the context of any given HR team or business. So just to share a bit about where we're at with Roche, because it's quite an interesting journey that we're on, is because of the size and scale of what we're trying to achieve. It can feel quite daunting, and it's something that is going to take quite some time to implement. So the first thing to consider is the use of technology, and the fact that we recognise that we need robust technology solutions in place to help enable us to focus on the right things from a HR point of view. I'm sure there's plenty of examples that you'll all have where you kind of get stuck into stuff in HR and you think, oh God, why am I doing this? I do this all the time. It's really repetitive, and there must be a better way of doing it, or there must be a quicker way that we can serve people and respond to their questions and give them the information they need much quicker. And so technology is really an enabler of working in a different way. We are looking at introducing, and we're kind of already implementing, a people portal across the entire organisation that will be the first point of contact for people when they've got something they need some support or help on. So that's the first thing. And that will then allow us to eliminate some of the kind of repetitive task-driven stuff that we get on a day-to-day basis, to enable us to look at the things that add much more value and impact. When we start looking at that, that's where we've really delved into this networked model across the organisation. And when we talk about a networked model, what we're looking towards doing is pulling people out of these silos, not only within HR disciplines, but also within territories and countries. So how can we work more effectively across different networks geographically, utilising the expertise and skills people have got, and utilising also the types of technology we're using now, because this also has been a massive learning through COVID, and realising that you don't have to be in a room with somebody physically to get stuff done. And whilst that's nice, and there are times that it can be really beneficial, actually it can sometimes slow things down, because trying to find that time to be in a room with somebody takes longer than needed because of all the sticks that need to go with it. So utilising this kind of technology, video-based technology, online chat, to create an opportunity for people to work across geography and support in a much more location agnostic way, not only means that we can provide this for the business, but also means that as individuals, we're going to have greater exposure and opportunity that perhaps historically, in a traditional way, we might not be able to do so. And so this networked model opens up lots of doors to the way in which we work. And within the network, we will have what's known as chapters, and each person within, I'm saying HR, but actually we've kind of transitioned and moved into being known as people and culture. So within culture, we'll each have a home chapter, which is our sort of core area of expertise, but the network principle enables us to come in and out of that chapter to be able to work on things much more collaboratively across the organisation. And then you partner with that alongside the shift in mindset. And I think this is the toughest piece, where people have to realise that which they've worked in the past is not going to be the same in the future. We're going to do things in a very different way in terms of how we respond to the business. And we need to move away from this idea that everything has to be perfect before we roll it out, and encouraging the idea of experimentation in a more viable product so that we can do things iteratively across the business. But because of the size and scale of what we're trying to do, it's not easy. It's quite a challenge to be able to move into this and really think about all the different intricacies that we've got in various countries and different regions, and what that's going to look like for the future. And that's probably the hardest piece around mindset, realising that we don't have the perfect model right now. We don't know exactly how it's going to be in the future, because we're co-creating it as we go. We're engaging with people across the organisation to support with that, rather than what traditionally you would have in a global organisation, which is your global function would make a decision and say, hey, this is our new structure, we're rolling it out, now just go do. And not doing that. What we're doing is we're creating something across the globe that has got input from hundreds of people from different countries and from different regions. So it's quite an interesting time, both challenging and exciting, all rolled into one. And some days, like I said, it feels great, and some days you think, oh my gosh, how are we ever going to get through this? But I absolutely believe it's the right thing to do longer term.
Wow. And that's really interesting, because there's a couple of points I want to kind of grab hold of there. One, once you've got scale involved, it just feels a bit more daunting, doesn't it? And I think this has led bigger organizations to sometimes go to more that traditional model of, this is the set structure, now roll it out, because it feels like you're more in control. But we've all worked in that environment, and you're not. People, there's so much kind of objection and debate, and people not wanting to be part of the new model, that actually I think it's can be even less successful. And so the only real solution is to co-create. And this is a real theme that I'm seeing across all agile transformation, no matter what your size is that it's evolutionary journey, and there's no end state per se, but it's grabbing hold of key themes such as the network, because this is where we're trying to move to, teams collaborating and self-organizing, getting people to connect with who is the right person to get the job done, as opposed to that up and down, and handovers to get the decisions made. So it's fascinating to see all of that coming through in your example there. I think what's really interesting as well is that just that kind of call out that, first of all, silos are never going to make us successful. And this is kind of how we're working now in the digital world. And actually, it's being real to the way that we're connecting with I haven't seen a friend, an actual friend, for about 6 months, but I've talked to them nearly every day around the world digitally. So it's interesting to see the pandemic sort of just bring this to life now, and all of those going, all right, so we know face-to-face is still important, but when and why and how do we use that to the right effect? Versus actually we can make businesses work in a network way really well. So that's really interesting that that's coming through there. Nabel, can I ask a couple of questions that's sort of coming through on chat, and then we'll see if we can go back to some of the others that we had. First of all, and we sort of touched on this a little bit, but what's your thoughts about how do we help transform this agile mindset? And because you kind of talked a little bit about it in that example just there, that you've got to start to get people to embrace this different type of mindset. What's your thoughts? And I know we had a kind of question about this. What's sort of your top tips on where you start with this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that you can consider. I think the first is identifying some potential early adopters. So if you know your business well and the people within it, you should hopefully be able to identify where are the people that are the ones that are actually curious and open to doing things in new and different ways. Spotting those people, getting them on board with experimenting and trying to do things in a way that is different to what's been done in the past. So I think that's the first thing to think about. I think the piece that then goes alongside that is recognizing that people will take a different kind of amount of time to get their head around doing things in a new way, and being okay with that, and realizing for some people they'll see this and think, oh my God, it's an amazing way of working, let's go. People that go, oh no, this won't work, we can't possibly do that. And from experience, personally, I've found that it's those people that say, no, this can never work. Anyhow, find a way for them to have even just the smallest real life experience of putting in something in a different way, for them to have their own light bulb moment or their own epiphany moment where they go, oh, actually, this is quite good. Maybe this could help me. But I think you need to do that in partnership with some of the kind of early adopters that you identify in the business. So rather than it just, oh, HR's got a new way of doing things and we're just going to tell you what you need to do. So finding those adopters so that it's not just this is a HR thing. Actually, this is about HR being the innovators and the pioneers of something, but perhaps doing it in partnership with the business. So I think the key is find those people that are curious enough to grab hold of it and partner with you on it, and then recognize ways in which you can allow people to have small experiences so they have their own epiphany moment to realize this is something that could be really great for the future. But then also knowing that it's okay that it takes a while for this change to happen, and not taking it personally. Sometimes it's really hard when you get passionate at this and then someone comes along and sort of, puts a downer on it and says, silly, you can't work in this way and that didn't work and I don't like it. Sometimes it can be really hard to hear that because you kind of feel strongly and passionate and know that it works. You kind of need to stay quite resilient, and be okay with the fact that people will have different views on it, and just know that bit by bit, day by day, gradually people will get on board with it. And you know what, a few might not, but hey, the way I look at that is it's their loss. I kind of think, it's their choice if they don't want to get on and experience this, but I think they're missing out on something.
Yeah, and I think I really like that. It is about Agile is all about self-organizing, allowing people to kind of be the best that they are, and so it's not a forced thing. And so exactly that. If it doesn't work for them, then that's okay. And we're also saying that waterfall ways of doing projects or ways of working kind of doesn't necessarily fully stop. But what we're saying is as the world is increasingly complex, increasingly full of constant change and rapid movements of what customers want and need, working in that more traditional way just doesn't get you the same answers or same results, because it's just too slow, and you end up releasing something that is just not going to meet the needs of your customers. And that's business as well as HR. So I think getting people comfortable with some of the concepts that sit in that business agility can really help as well bring people into what might be an agile mindset for them. And I would say that definitely this idea of experimentation is really important. So creating situations that people can experience working in a different way. And that could be really simple as just creating a prototype to test on a very basic level and just getting some feedback. And then they take that into kind of more the ways that they've been working already. Through to, okay, team, we are now going to embrace this new way of working, and we're going to give it for 3 months and we're going to see how it goes. But if you treat it more as an experiment, it's okay for for people to not know all the answers yet, and for things now and then to not go right, and then learn from that and build the kind of result together. So I would really encourage you to embrace this concept of experimentation. I'm going to move into a couple of other questions. So we do have a quick question of what was the peer-to-peer recognition initiative that you had at River Island, Abel? What any kind of particular comments on that one?
Yeah, I think what we recognise, and again, it's about finding where there's something that's not working and thinking about creative solutions to put into practice. What we learned was at River, we weren't always great at just saying thanks. We were just always so very busy and so nose forward getting stuff done. It was a very fast-paced business. And so what we wanted to do was find a really simple mechanism to enable people to just show some appreciation and show some thanks to one another for the small things that happen on a regular basis. So it was a very, very simple solution. No fancy pants technology in the background or anything. It was literally utilising our organisational values, encouraging people to base their thank yous on the values to connect it into the organisation. We literally used a Survey Monkey as our mechanism to do that. So we encourage people to just pop their nomination on a Survey Monkey. And at the end of each month, we looked at the nominations and we picked out a couple of kind of highly commended people each month and issued a monthly kind of digital newsletter that was a shout out really to say, here's the great recognition that's happened on a peer-to-peer basis across the business. Here's a couple of people that we see as being our kind of above and beyond and highly commended people. And what we did then at the end of the year is that we looked at those people that had been acknowledged as being above and beyond, and we kind of rolled that into some end of year awards. And we had a very simple title for it, which is the Pride Awards, which is people of River Island delivering excellence. And it was just really quick and simple. It was, you can invest in some quite expensive, smart kind of technology for this kind of thing, but we didn't need to. We just had a simple comms, a Survey Monkey, and then the encouragement of people just saying thanks to each other. And for the few years that I was there, that we were running it every month on month, we got more and more nominations of people to acknowledge their appreciation. So it was quite a simple solution.
Great, thank you for that. And something similar at Sky Betting and Gaming, actually, particularly connected to starting to move away from reward being linked directly to individual kind of performance and ratings and bonuses. So alongside sort of that delinking of performance and reward and moving to more kind of collective team-based reward, they also created these pots where people could, first of all, actually invest in their own learning as they wanted to a certain amount, but also that teams could constantly recognize each other and people that they've worked with on the spot. And they created basically a Slack channel that enabled that to happen. So again, it was quite simple tech that seemed to work really effectively. And the more you get back to people actually being able to own how you recognize each other, I think that's what's really powerful around those kind of solutions. Fantastic. So we've got some great comments from Joanne around what does it mean to fail fast to learn, which is great, around building your own solutions. So this idea of co-creating in HR just as much as across business as we start to build our new model around people experience. And I think that's important, that all of what we're talking about here relates to HR just as much as the business. And actually starting with ourselves is a really important space. Martin, you've got a question. Over to you.
Yes, thanks, Natal. Nice to talk to you again, and thanks for the presentation and inputs from everybody. I just had a quick question around phases. I'm looking at a potential role where there's a lot of remediation work to be done in HR. It's described as right back to basics, fixing core processes. There's a HR system implementation planned but delayed, etc. And so there's a lot to review. And I was interested to understand your thoughts about deploying Agile in that, in a COVID context, remote working, how best to potentially approach taking the positive aspects of Agile in a first couple of months going into a role like that.
Well, that sounds, first of all, like a really exciting role. And actually some similarities to what we were experiencing at River. I think the first thing you need to do is understand some of the basic principles of Agile methodologies. And I would suggest, from my point of view, I'd be looking at what are the things that need to happen and create my backlog of work. Look through that backlog of work and really ascertain how to prioritize the things that are going to have the biggest impact and add the most value. And then look at how you build that into a series of sprints and really consider who you need to be involved in each of those sprints to be able to deliver against each of the things on the backlog. That's what I'd be thinking about from a process point of view, to enable getting things done, because the speed in which you will get things worked through will be exponentially quicker by utilising some of the core principles of Agile working than it would be if you went through it in a traditional waterfall project management approach. I'm certain of it, just from experiencing it in the past. So, having those sprints, having the daily stand-ups to just keep people on track, and getting things worked through by, checking at the end of each sprint, having a retrospective to check you're on track and see who you need to engage with as you progress through things. That personally would be the first thing I would consider. I don't know what you think, Natal.
Yeah, I think I think it can feel a bit daunting because you're trying to do a transformation and change, and then you're thinking, well, should I bring in a change of how we actually do the change? So that sort of double layer can feel a bit daunting at the start. However, I would say that the nature of what you've described is sort of perfect for this way of working, because it's also quite tangible, because it is about, infrastructure. It's about kind of process. It's about kind of delivering things. And that actually can be easier for people to get their head around in terms of how to use Agile to develop things and deliver. But also, go light, so some of the core principles, I think definitely the idea of a backlog of work. What is the most important thing to work on first and why, and what are we actually going to deliver? So, and holding yourselves sort of accountable to that. Okay, well, in 1 month's time, we believe that we can do this. And we're then going to look at how we did that. And, first of all, did we achieve it? What's been people's feedback? And what do we now think is the next important thing to work on? Because I think if you're embracing such a big organizational change like that, you can over egg or over plan what you've got to do, and stripping it down into, well, what is the most important thing to solve first and why, and let's do that. And actually, by doing that, we're going to learn things about what to do next. So it actually should make it easier to manage, but it is a bit of a shift to begin with. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you both very much. That's been really helpful.
Pleasure.
Good luck.
Good luck.
Thank you. I'm sure I'll be following up after this.
Yeah, you can do the next meetup and tell us about your story.
With a bit of luck.
Great. So I'm going to get Nabel to say a couple of words of thanks before everyone heads off. Nabel, over to you. Any final words?
Thank you. Yeah, just, use this as a mechanism to stay connected. Now, if there's things that people want to talk about in more detail or want to, find out a bit more about, by all means, get in touch. I think it's the only way we can learn and improve across our businesses is just sharing our own experiences of what's worked and what doesn't. And I'm very open to connecting with people. So So feel free, you know, I might not have all the answers always, but we can at least kind of chat things through and see what works perhaps for the context of your own business or for your own teams.
Excellent. And I'm the same. I love talking about these topics and really happy to have a chat at any time, both digitally or even on the traditional phone. And anyone in Scotland, maybe a coffee one day. Okay, so shout out, there is a book, 20% off at PXO Culture. And our next meetup is on the 24th of November. And if you're in the moment, you know, in the midst of looking at strategy, this will be a great session to get you thinking about how do you get that buy-in and start to really engage people across the organization. Great. And as Tim is shouting out there, we've got an interview series going with Tom Huck from the HR Trend Institute, and that's going to start coming out every week on LinkedIn and our YouTube channel. And we look at lots of different topics that we're discussing here. So please have a look out for that. We've just discussed all eyes on HR as a result of the pandemic. So it's a good discussion.